Hey guys, welcome to the behind the scenes for the bet losing machine. Okay, so we'll start out with the reason that most of you are probably watching, which is the backstory for the bet. So the story of the bet actually starts all the way back at ISM 2015. One of the machine builders that we had at ISM 2015 was Toothpaste 35, whom I'll just call Noah from now on, because that's his actual name. So at this point it had been a while since the last Toothpaste 35 video, and it was kind of already established that Noah had stopped building. He was retired, I guess, and he wasn't going to make any more machines except for the one at ISM. But I believe it was the day before the event, he made a bet with the entire ISM team that if his machine didn't work for the live fall down the next day, he was going to have to make another machine at home. And on the day of the fall down, his machine didn't work. And while everyone else was busy celebrating the overall success of the event, the only thing Noah could think was this.
I don't want to make it. Yes! Come on.
That soundbite's actually in the official behind the scenes video, by the way. If you were confused about what that meant the first time you watched it, this should help explain. But Noah, not being one to break a promise, or a bet, went home and made another machine, despite totally not wanting to. And that's what Rube Goldberg Machine 32 is. That's the punishment for the bet. Alright, so I'm going to completely change the subject here for a second, but I promise it has to do with the bet. So over the years, one of the requests that I've seen on multiple occasions is that I should do something bigger than a regular one-table machine. Specifically make a two-table machine.
That's
it. While your dad and I went out shopping for another table while you were gone.
And I've always kind of been against this idea because I don't have enough materials, I don't want to spend all that much time on it, I want to get machines done a little bit quicker than that, I don't want to have that many fails, and just a bunch of other reasons. So I've kind of always been against the idea. Alright, so here's what that has to do with the actual bet. Fast forward to ISM 2016. Noah actually shows up to the event that year to watch the fall down, even though he wasn't actually part of the team that helped build it that year. So it was kind of a spur-of-the-moment decision, but I just decided to go up to Noah and make a bet with him on the spot, the same way that he made a bet with us the year before.
I'm going to make the same bet this year, except my consequence, instead of trying to make another machine, I have to make a machine on two tables. Okay, it's official now.
You see, I thought this was pretty fair because he had already said on multiple occasions that he didn't want to make another machine and he was kind of retired from building, and I had already said on multiple occasions that I didn't want to make a two-table machine, so to me, these punishments were pretty equal. And my machine failed. I'm the kind of guy that follows through on a bet regardless, but since he had already fulfilled the punishment for his bet the year before, I kinda had to. So that's basically the story of the bet losing machine. At ISM 2015, Noah made a bet with the rest of the ISM team that if his machine didn't work for the final fall down, he was gonna have to make another machine, and I made a bet with Noah at ISM 2016 that if my machine didn't work for the final fall down, I was gonna have to make a two-table machine. In both cases, our machines didn't work for the final fall down, and we both fulfilled the requirements of our bets. So with a machine of such length and complexity as the bet losing machine, you're gonna have a lot of fails. In fact, I had 297 for this machine, which isn't the most I've ever heard, but it's still a lot by pretty much any measure. And especially after a number that high, it can get pretty frustrating after a while. So, of course I had the fails where I reacted like this.
Oh, really? No! No! What? No! Huh? How? What? How? Oh my god!
But in order to cope with such failure, you have to learn how to deal with it, and for me, that way is by giving sarcastic remarks every time something fails.
Hold up. On what planet? Absolutely not. Huh. Oh my god. Interesting. I don't even know how it does that. What in the world? Don't do this. I don't know what to do. That doesn't make sense. That's a new one. That's the first time that's happened. What? Not again! Wait, what? Wow, that's a new one. You hit the side, but not the... Huh? 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 Dude, you can't just... You can't just... Okay. Boy! No, 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 no. Nice! What is wrong with this thing? Unbelievable! Not even a little bit close. Oh, you can do it, boy! Excuse me, sir, would you mind moving? Come on, man, don't do that. Please don't. You wanna, like, not do that? No. No, 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 no. No, 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 no. Oh my god.
So if you're getting frustrated because your machine is failing, then I don't know, maybe try what I do and just get sarcastic. It works for me. Now, like I said, this machine failed. A lot. But I'd say probably 90% or more of those fails happened within the first 20 seconds. Some of the fails that happened the most often during that first segment of the machine were the swinging track swing catapulting the ball somewhere where it wasn't supposed to go, the first trick where the dominoes didn't provide enough weight to tilt the lever, the spinning tube trick, and the white ball missing the holder on top of the car. Now, one of the tricks that was actually problematic from a little later on in the machine was actually the falling brick technique. Now, even though it did fail a few times, the fact that it didn't work wasn't really the main problem. When it falls, it actually causes a ton of vibrations throughout the entire table, and I had a bunch of takes where something else would go off early because of the vibrations. Now, one of the tricks that surprisingly didn't fail all that much was the launching clothespin trick. It only completely missed the target one time, and the other very few times that it failed, it was because it hit the target and then bounced out. The other thing that failed surprisingly few times, and I think this really might surprise you, is the expanding ruler trick. Not the actual expanding part, but when the balls roll down it. There are no barriers on the side of that ruler, so you'd expect the balls to fall off every once in a while, right? Well, believe it or not, that happened 0 times. Like, literally 0 times. And keep in mind, there are 2 balls that roll down that ruler for each test. And then, of course, there are the fails that happened only once, but are just so weird that I had to include them in this video. Some of you may already know this, but this machine actually only made it to the second table 5 times. 6 times if you include the time that I forgot to reset the string that connects the 2 tables. So to do the math real quick, that's 293 fails for the first table and 4 fails for the second table, because the 5th time was when it actually worked. One thing that I've done a lot in previous machines that I tried to not do as much of in this machine is the kind of overlapping and returning to old tricks that I used to do. Let me explain with an example. So basically, instead of having a trick where it does use 1 and then goes to another trick and then comes back for use 2 and then goes to another thing and then comes back to use 3 and then goes back to trick 1 for the second use of that trick, and I didn't do any of that in this machine because I feel like it's a lot to keep track of as a viewer, and if you can't really remember what use 1 or use 2 was for a specific trick, when it returns for use 3, you're kind of like, yeah, I remember that trick before, I remember it did something, but I don't really remember what, and now I kind of feel like I can't appreciate that trick as much as I would be able to if I just saw all 3 or 4 or however many uses in sequence consecutively. So I tried to not do that as much in this machine as I did in previous machines like the Rhett and Link machine, and I really like the final product. I think this way is actually a little bit easier on the viewer because they don't have to keep track of as much and they can just kind of enjoy the machine in a more linear fashion. The other thing that's really interesting about this machine is the lack of traditional multi-use. So the traditional format for a multi-use element is a ball rolls over a track in position 1, the track moves, and a ball rolls over the track in position 2. And believe it or not, there are only between like 2 and 3 tracks in this machine that actually fulfill that requirement. Now the 2 tracks that I can think of that follow this format off the top of my head are 1, the track that's attached to the gear that rotates around the single point, and 2, the track that gets pulled 90 degrees and catches the purple bouncy ball as it falls through the rails of the trick where the track gets pulled out from underneath it. All of the other tracks in this machine are either 1, stationary and they don't move, 2, the ball rolls over it in position 1, but then the track moves and it doesn't roll over it in position 2, Or the other way around, it doesn't roll over in position 1, but then it moves and it rolls over in position 2. And then there's some more obscure reasons why a specific track doesn't follow that format. The main one being when a ball rolls over the track as it's moving, but it doesn't really use it twice. Actually, now that I think about it, there are a lot more examples of balls that roll over tracks as they're moving, but still, I stand by the fact that this does not count as the traditional multi-use element format. But if you don't believe me, feel free to take a look at this machine yourself. Go back through the video and look. There are no tracks that follow that format except for those two. Alright, so now I'm going to talk about some of the actual specific tricks in this machine and show you guys some early test footage. So the first thing I had to figure out was the configuration that I wanted for the tables. I had to figure out what would work best for building, but also what would look best for filming. I eventually settled on this sort of L shape where the tables were at 90-degree angles to each other. So once I had the tables where I wanted them, it was time to start building. The very first trick that I made for this machine was the swinging track swing that I made all the way back in early February. That was quickly followed by the collapsing track dominoes, the triple auto tilt trick, and all the stuff on the board. And before I knew it, I already had a pretty good start to the machine. The 90-degree curved auto tilt trick actually started out a whole lot simpler than it ended up. Originally, I only had to do a simple auto tilt, but then I decided that it was way too easy and then I added a track on top. Alright, so here's some early test footage from when I decided that it was actually time to record some of the tricks. Now, notice that I didn't have everything connected at this point. I had to use my hands to pick up balls and put them in certain places, but surprisingly, the entire thing actually worked. Now for such a simple, straightforward trick, the loop-de-loops were actually quite difficult to figure out. Originally I didn't even have them in there at all. I was going to use some kind of plank of wood, but then I couldn't figure out what to do with it, so I decided to do the loop-de-loops. But then I was going to do one loop going one direction and then one loop going 90 degrees to it, and that didn't really work too well. So then I decided to do two of them in parallel, and that ended up working a lot better. So the expanding ruler trick was one of those foreign object tricks that I've had in my mind for a while, but I just never really got around to building. I've had that folding ruler for a long time, and I never really got around to making it into a machine trick until this machine. And I'm really glad that I did, because it's one of my favorite tricks in this machine. Except it's not. It's not one of my favorite tricks in this machine. It's pretty lame and boring and not all that complicated, but it looks nice and I'm kind of proud of it, so... Now the tube trick was something that I actually discovered completely by accident, because honestly, how else could you discover something like that? It's one of those tricks that you watch it and you're like, how is that possible? And to tell you the truth, I don't know. I don't know how that trick works. I'm not gonna lie, I have no idea. It was reliable enough to put in a machine, but I don't even know how it works. The next trick that I made was something that I honestly think is one of the most underrated tricks in this machine. At least when I watch it, it kind of gets overlooked a little bit. And that is the two twisting tracks right down the middle of the first table. It just looks so elegant and neat the way that they just spin around so slowly and perfectly and line up in the exact right spots. It wasn't even that difficult of a trick to design, I just really like it because the motion is so smooth and elegant looking. And then I made all the stuff that goes underneath the twisting tracks that I mentioned before. This was another huge challenge because I had to make sure everything was low enough that it would be able to fit underneath it, but I also had to make sure that the tracks above them still had room to turn. Which is the same thing. I think it was right around this point that I realized that I was going to completely run out of connects, or at least certain parts, so I decided to ask my CAD teacher if I could borrow the same connects pieces that I used for 6 Simple Machines and bring them home to use for this machine, and he said yes, and I ended up bringing home all of the pieces that I used for 6 Simple Machines. And I ended up using almost all of them as well. Okay, not really, not almost all of the pieces, but almost all of certain pieces. But this also meant that I had to keep a running list of how many pieces I was actually borrowing from those bins, so every time I took a piece out, I had to write a little tally mark on a piece of paper just to keep track so I could return them later, which was kind of a nuisance, but you know, you kind of have to do it. So the next trick that I made was actually a rejected trick. I made it and then immediately realized that it was way too fragile and it looked terrible. But when I was showing it off how it worked in the video, it broke anyway, so that's why I did this. And I'm actually really glad I got rid of that trick because that's what I ended up replacing with the twisting track ball lift trick and the falling brick trick, which were way cooler tricks anyway. And then I moved on to what I think ended up actually being the most overlooked trick in this entire machine, and that is the tape measure trick. Just like with the 90-degree curved auto tilt trick, this was going to be a lot simpler than it ended up being. But then I decided that I'm going to add 2 uses for the tape measure instead of just 1, and it ended up turning out a lot better. So the next trick I ended up making was the flexing bridge trick, and I'm actually going to talk about this trick a little bit more than I have for the other ones because this is probably the most technically complicated trick that I've ever had to make. This flexing bridge trick was actually inspired by a really old game that I used to have. It was like a little obstacle course for a marble that you controlled with your fingers, and one of the very first obstacles in the obstacle course was a bridge that very closely resembles the trick that I made for this machine. And you can't really tell from the top view because I tried to hide it as best as I could, but this trick's actually really intricate. Here's what it looks like from the bottom, and that's just to make the tracks actually flex. The next part was actually to connect it to a Kinect motor, which was connected to a piston, which makes it move automatically, which was also another big challenge. Once I was done with all of that, I ended up with this. But then I had to add playing cards on each of the tracks so that the ball would always travel forward. Now the trick where the ping pong ball rolls down the marble track that the marbles rolled down earlier was actually a trick I discovered by accident. I decided to just try it out and see what happened, and it actually ended up working. It ended up rolling perfectly over the segment that drops down, and then perfectly over the container that the marbles fall into, and then perfectly into the track where the car starts, and then perfectly down that track as well. And as soon as I saw that that worked, I knew I had to use it in the machine. The next trick I made was the trick with the Brio train and the 2 tilting tracks above it. Believe it or not, this trick was actually inspired by the sign revealer in the Invention 11's video 11 Inventions 5. So at that point, I was done with table 1. I had officially done a little bit more than half of the bet losing machine, since the first table is slightly larger than the second table. Since I had an entire table done, I figured I would do some full table tests just to see how everything worked, and believe it or not, I actually had a lot of success with these. I was really confident with the first table at first, but then I don't know what happened when I started doing full machine tests, but man, that first table just failed all the time. The first trick I made for the second table was the gear trick. Now, unlike some of the other tricks I talked about before, this trick actually started out more complicated than it ended up being. The next trick I made was actually that little swinging track that goes off near the end of the machine. When I first built it, it had a really nice, smooth motion to it that somehow got lost as time went on. Originally, it looked really smooth and elegant when it worked, and it still worked at the end, but it just kind of didn't look as nice. The next 2 tricks I made were the spinning cup and ball lift trick and the expanding track catcher trick, both of which I have literally no clue how I came up with. The next trick that I made was the trick where the ball gets pulled along and then the track underneath it gets pulled out from underneath it. This trick was actually inspired by a really old Pitakura Suichi trick that I'd seen many years ago and wanted to include in a machine, and I've actually tried it a bunch of times, and I just didn't have the right materials, I didn't build it the right way, it just never really worked out until now. Pitakura Suichi actually did it a little bit differently, where the weight that pulls the track is actually the same weight that falls off the table, whereas mine just pushes the weight off the table. And also they did it with a train and not a ball, which I honestly think is even more impressive. Now the next trick that I made actually uses the Invention 11's little green car that he gave to me at the Gillette event. He used it back in the coin flipping machine and a couple other things in the past as well. I decided to repurpose it, and instead of using it as an actual car, I decided to use it on its side and have it turn a track. Despite being one of the weirdest tricks I've probably made in a while, I'm pretty proud of how it looks, even though it's sort of just a connection. Now the next trick I made was actually the trick that I'm probably the most proud of out of the entire machine, and that's the auto tilt shifting zigzag board trick. Now this is going to sound completely ridiculous, but I was actually inspired to make this trick by the design of leaves that I saw on the side of a tissue box. Now the reason I like this trick so much is because it's a little bit different than the regular connects contraption or track trick that I usually make, and this might surprise you, but even though my strength is typically connect contraptions and track tricks, usually the tricks that I am most proud of are the ones that kind of go out of my comfort zone a little bit, and this one is definitely one of those tricks. The other reason I like it is because it took a really long time to design everything. It's made of 4 different modules, this is one of them, and each module is a flat segment that doesn't move, and one segment is a track with an actual zigzag piece in it that does move. Basically, I just made 4 of these modules and lined them up in alternating directions on the board, and then tested them with a ping pong ball to make sure that it actually worked. After that, I split the 4 modules into 2 pulley systems, each one consisting of a weight that falls off the table and pulls each pair of tracks in alternating directions. The next part of this trick was the actual auto tilt part where the car slides back and forth, which meant that I had to make sure that the weights were calibrated correctly so that it would tilt back and forth automatically. I also had to make sure that the timing of the weights that pull the zigzag pieces was correct so that the ball would actually be able to roll down in the opposite direction. In the end, I think this trick came together really well. I'm very proud of the motion. It looks really smooth and aesthetically pleasing, and honestly I think it's probably my favorite trick in the entire machine. So after that, I was pretty much done. The only thing I had left to do was put on some finishing connections and stuff and put in the actual signs that flip down after each table and then start testing. So that's it. That's basically the entire process of the bet losing machine all the way from February to June. So there's actually one other thing that I want to talk about in this video real quick, and that's the thing that I said in the main video, which is that I don't want to make another 2-table machine. So I have a few reasons for this, the primary one being that it just takes forever. I mean, this one took me 4 entire months. And especially with college coming up, I don't really think I can devote that much time to any one single project anytime in the foreseeable future. There are a few other reasons too, like I don't have that many materials and I don't want to have that many fails, but the time thing is the main reason. And those same reasons were the same reasons that I was reluctant to do it in the first place, but looking back on it now, I'm really glad that I did it. So I think that's it for the behind the scenes video. I hope you guys enjoyed getting some insider info on the bet and the machine itself. If you want to watch the main video for the bet losing machine, you can click right up there. If you want to see some of my other projects, you can click right down there. And if you want to subscribe to my channel, you can click right here. Alright, that's it for me. I'm JackofAllSpades98, and I'll see you guys in the next video.